You've been here before. Standing at a crossroads where the right choice isn't obvious, where doing what feels good conflicts with doing what seems right, where the rules you've been taught suddenly feel like chains, or where breaking them feels like falling into chaos. You pause. You question. You wonder if morality is something solid beneath your feet, or just another story we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. This tension you feel, this friction between duty and outcome, between principle and consequence, isn't new. It's ancient. It's been wrestled with by minds far sharper than most, and yet it remains unresolved. Because the question at the heart of ethics, the question that determines how you should live, has never had a single answer that satisfies everyone. Two titans of moral philosophy stand on opposite sides of this divide, each offering you a different map through the moral wilderness. Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill. Two names, two visions, two completely different answers to the same unbearable question. What makes an action right? You might think this is abstract. You might think this belongs in dusty lecture halls, scribbled in margins of books nobody reads anymore. But you'd be wrong. Because every time you decide whether to lie to spare someone's feelings, every time you weigh your own happiness against someone else's need, every time you follow a rule even when it hurts or break one because the situation demands it, you are standing exactly where Kant and Mill stood. You are choosing between their worlds. Kant tells you this. Morality is not about results. It's not about happiness, not about pleasure, not about making the world a better place by whatever means necessary. Morality is about duty. It's about following rules that are universal, absolute, and grounded in reason itself. You do the right thing because it is right, not because it leads to good outcomes. You tell the truth because lying violates a fundamental law of rationality. You treat people as ends in themselves, never merely as tools for your purposes. The rightness of your action doesn't depend on what happens next. It depends on the principle behind it. It depends on whether you could will that principle to become a universal law without contradiction. Mill tells you something else entirely. He tells you that morality is precisely about results, about consequences, about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The right action is the one that maximizes well-being, that reduces suffering, that creates the most good in the world. Rules are useful, yes, but only because they generally lead to better outcomes. They are shortcuts, guidelines, tools. But when following a rule causes more harm than breaking it, when rigid adherence to principle creates unnecessary suffering, you adjust, you adapt, you calculate. Morality is not found in abstract duties divorced from human experience. It is found in the lived reality of pleasure and pain, joy and suffering. These are not mere academic differences. They are fundamentally incompatible ways of understanding what it means to be good, and the stakes could not be higher. Because, depending on which framework you choose, the same action can be either heroic or monstrous. The same decision can be either the height of moral integrity or the depth of moral failure. Imagine this. A murderer comes to your door. He asks where your friend is hiding. You know, your friend is upstairs, terrified, vulnerable. Kant says you must tell the truth. Not because it leads to good outcomes, obviously it doesn't, but because lying violates the categorical imperative. It treats the murderer as less than a rational being. It makes an exception for yourself that you couldn't universalize. To lie, even to save a life, is to corrupt the very foundation of morality. Mill looks at the same situation and sees it completely differently. The murderer at your door is not a philosophical puzzle, it's an emergency. A moment where the calculus is brutally simple. Lie and your friend lives. Tell the truth and your friend dies. The greatest happiness principle demands the lie. Utility demands the lie. Any moral system that tells you to cooperate with a murderer because of abstract duties has lost sight of what morality is actually for. You see the problem now. You see why this matters. Because this isn't just about Kant and Mill. It's about you. It's about the rules you follow and the ones you break. It's about whether you believe morality is something discovered through reason, written into the fabric of rational thought itself, or something constructed through experience, measured by its impact on human welfare. It's about whether you are the kind of person who holds the line no matter what, or the kind who bends when reality demands it. Both men were brilliant. Both were systematic. Both built entire ethical frameworks from the ground up. And both frameworks have shaped the modern world in ways you might not even recognize. The language of human rights, of dignity, of treating people as ends and not means, that comes from Kant. The logic of public policy, of cost-benefit analysis, of reforms aimed at reducing suffering and increasing well-being, that comes from Mill. You live in a world built by their ideas, and yet their ideas remain at war. So which one is right? Which rules save us? Which rules trap us? Or is the question itself flawed? Is it possible that both are seeing something true, something essential, but from angles so different that their truths cannot be reconciled? That's what we're here to explore, not to crown a winner, not to dismiss either as foolish or outdated, but to understand what each offers, what each costs, and what it means for how you navigate the moral complexity of your own life. This is not going to be easy. Philosophy never is. But it will be worth it. Because at the end of this journey, you won't just know what Kant said or what Mill argued. You'll know something deeper. You'll know which rules you trust, which outcomes you value, and why. You'll know where you stand when the ground beneath you starts to shift. And in a world that constantly asks you to choose between principle and pragmatism, between duty and consequence, that knowledge is not optional. It's essential. Part 2. The World Before the Revolution. You need to understand where these ideas came from, because moral philosophy doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's born from specific historical moments, specific crises, specific questions that a culture can no longer avoid. Kant and Mill didn't just wake up one day and decide to reinvent ethics. They were responding to the world around them, to the intellectual tremors shaking the foundations of how people understood right and wrong. And to grasp what they built, you need to see what they were building against. Let's start with Kant. Immanuel Kant lived in 18th century Prussia, in the city of Kingsburg, which he supposedly never left in his entire life. He was born in 1724 and died in 1804, which means his formative years coincided with the Enlightenment, that extraordinary period when reason was being unleashed on everything: science, politics, religion, and yes, morality. The old certainties were crumbling. The divine right of kings was being questioned. Religious authority was no longer the uncontested source of moral truth. Thinkers like Hume were arguing that reason alone couldn't give you moral knowledge, that morality was grounded in sentiment, in feeling, in the passions, and this troubled Kant deeply, because Kant believed in reason. He believed it was the most powerful tool humanity possessed, the thing that separated us from mere animals driven by instinct and desire. And if morality couldn't be grounded in reason, if it was just a matter of subjective feelings or cultural traditions or divine commands we had to accept on faith, then morality had no firm foundation. It became arbitrary, relative, unstable. Kant couldn't accept that. He needed to show that morality was objective, universal, and knowable through reason alone. He needed to rescue ethics from the skeptics and the sentimentalists. He needed to prove that there were moral laws as certain and binding as the laws of mathematics. This was his project. This was the fire that drove him. And the world he lived in made that project urgent. Because the Enlightenment wasn't just an intellectual movement. It was a social and political upheaval. People were starting to ask dangerous questions about authority, about hierarchy, about who had the right to tell others how to live. And Kant saw both the promise and the peril in this. The promise was human autonomy, the idea that rational beings could govern themselves according to laws they gave themselves. The peril was chaos, the collapse of moral order into mere preference and power. Kant's moral philosophy emerged from this tension. He wanted to show that freedom and law were not opposites, but partners. That true freedom wasn't doing whatever you wanted. It was acting according to rational principles you could universalize. That autonomy meant giving yourself the moral law, not escaping from law altogether. This wasn't just theory. This was a response to a world in transition. A world where the old answers no longer worked, but the new ones hadn't yet been found. Now shift forward. Jump to 19th century Britain, to the world of John Stuart Mill. Mill was born in 1806, 2 years after Kant died, and he grew up in a completely different intellectual and social environment. Britain was undergoing the Industrial Revolution. Cities were exploding in size. Factories were churning out goods and grinding up workers. Poverty was rampant. Inequality was stark. And the traditional moral frameworks, the ones based on abstract duties and religious commandments, seemed utterly disconnected from the suffering happening on the streets. Mill was raised by his father, James Mill, and the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Both of them utilitarians who believed that morality was about maximizing happiness and minimizing pain. They trained young John Stuart with an intensity that would be considered abusive today. By age 3, he was reading Greek. By 8, he'd mastered Latin and was reading Plato. By his early 20s, he'd had a mental breakdown, realizing that his entire education had been focused on logic and utility but had neglected beauty, emotion, poetry, the things that make life worth living. He recovered, but the experience changed him. It made him realize that happiness wasn't just about pleasure in some crude sense. It was richer, more complex, more deeply human. And Mill looked around at the world he lived in and saw immense, preventable suffering. He saw children working in mines. He saw women denied basic rights. He saw entire populations living in misery while a small elite enjoyed obscene luxury. And he asked himself, what good is a moral philosophy that can't address this? What use are abstract principles if they don't reduce suffering? If they don't make the world better in tangible, measurable ways? Mill became convinced that the purpose of morality was practical. It was about improving human welfare. It was about creating the greatest good for the greatest number. Everything else was secondary. So here's what you need to see. Kant and Mill weren't just offering competing theories. They were products of different worlds facing different crises. Kant faced the crisis of moral authority in an age of reason. How do you ground ethics when God's authority is questioned and human feelings are too variable to be trusted? His answer: ground it in reason itself, in principles that any rational being must accept. Mill faced the crisis of mass suffering in an age of industrial transformation. How do you address preventable pain when abstract duties seem disconnected from real consequences? His answer: ground ethics in welfare, in the measurable impact of actions on human happiness. These contexts matter. Because when you understand what each man was trying to solve, you understand why their systems look the way they do. Kant wasn't being cold or abstract for no reason. He was trying to protect morality from collapsing into relativism or tyranny. Mill wasn't being calculating or reductive for sport. He was trying to create a moral framework that could actually reduce suffering in the real world. And yet, despite their different starting points, both men shared something crucial. They both rejected traditional religious morality as the ultimate foundation. They both believed that human beings could figure out right and wrong through natural human faculties. Reason for Kant, experience and observation for Mill. They both believed in human progress, in the possibility of moral improvement. They both took ethics seriously, not as a set of customs or conventions, but as a systematic field of inquiry with real answers. But the paths they took from these shared commitments diverged completely. Kant went inward, into the structure of rational thought itself, and found moral laws written into the very nature of reason. Mill went outward, into the world of human experience, and found moral guidance in the patterns of pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering. One built a fortress of principle. The other built a calculus of consequences. And this divergence, this fundamental split in how they approached the same question, created two distinct traditions in moral philosophy that are still fighting for dominance today. Every time policymakers debate whether to prioritize rights or welfare, every time you struggle between doing what's right in principle versus what's right in practice, you are standing at the intersection where Kant and Mill parted ways. The stage is set. The context is clear. Now it's time to enter their systems, to see exactly what each man built and why he built it that way. To understand the architecture of their moral universes before we can judge which one, if either, offers the better map for navigating your own. Part 3. Kant's Cathedral of Reason. You are standing before something immense, something austere and beautiful in its own way. This is Kant's moral philosophy, and it doesn't bend. It doesn't negotiate. It stands like a cathedral built entirely from pure reason. Every pillar supporting every arch, everything locked into place with geometric precision. And at its center, holding the entire structure together, is a single principle, the categorical imperative. But before you can grasp what that means, you need to understand what Kant is rejecting. He's rejecting every moral system that makes rightness depend on results. Every system that says an action is good because it leads to happiness, or pleasure, or divine reward, or social stability. All of those, Kant says, are hypothetical imperatives. They take the form: if you want X, then do Y. If you want to be happy, be kind. If you want to go to heaven, follow the commandments. If you want a stable society, obey the law. And what's wrong with that? Nothing, if you're talking about prudence or skill. But if you're talking about morality, everything. Because hypothetical imperatives make goodness conditional. They make it depend on what you happen to want, what your goals happen to be. And that means morality becomes subjective, variable, contingent. It means there's no moral difference between someone who's kind because they genuinely respect others and someone who's kind because they want to be liked. It means Hitler could escape moral condemnation if he simply didn't care about the things morality supposedly promotes. Kant won't accept this. He insists that true moral obligations are categorical. They bind you, regardless of what you want, regardless of your goals, regardless of the consequences. They take the form: do Y, period. Not because it gets you something. Not because it makes you happy. But because reason itself demands it. Because to act otherwise would be to violate the very structure of rational thought. This is where the categorical imperative enters. Kant formulates it in several ways, but they all point to the same underlying principle. The first formulation, the most famous one, says this: act only according to that maxim by which you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. Let that sink in. What Kant is saying is that before you act, you need to examine the principle behind your action, the maxim you're following. And then you need to ask yourself, could I rationally will that everyone, in all similar circumstances, follow this same maxim? If the answer is no, if universalizing your maxim leads to a contradiction, then the action is wrong. Not because of its consequences, but because it fails the test of rational consistency. Take lying. You're considering lying to get out of trouble. What's the maxim? Something like, when it's convenient, make false promises you don't intend to keep. Now, universalize it. Imagine everyone followed this rule. What happens? The institution of promising collapses. Because promises only work if people generally tell the truth. If everyone lied whenever it was convenient, nobody would believe anyone's promises, and the whole practice would cease to function. So the maxim contradicts itself. When universalized, you're essentially saying, I want to take advantage of a system that only exists because most people don't do what I'm about to do. You're making an exception for yourself that you couldn't rationally extend to everyone. And that, Kant says, is the essence of immorality. This isn't about consequences, it's about consistency. It's about whether you're treating yourself as special, as exempt from the rules that govern rational beings. And Kant believes that reason itself forbids this kind of special pleading. That morality is ultimately about recognizing that you are one rational agent among many, with no privileged status. The second formulation makes this even clearer. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, and never merely as a means. This is profound. Kant is saying that every human being has inherent dignity, inherent worth, simply by virtue of being a rational agent capable of self-governance. And you violate that dignity whenever you use someone merely as a tool for your purposes, without respecting their autonomy, their capacity to set their own ends. Notice the word merely. Kant isn't saying you can never use people as means. You use the cashier as a means to buy groceries. You use the doctor as a means to get treatment. That's fine, as long as you also respect them as ends, as beings with their own goals and dignity. What's forbidden is reducing them to nothing but instruments, treating them as if their only value is what they can do for you. This is why lying is wrong for Kant. Not primarily because of the harm it causes, though that matters too, but because it treats the person you're lying to as less than a rational being. It manipulates them. It denies them the information they need to make their own informed decisions. It uses them merely as a means to your ends. And this is why Kant's ethics feels so demanding. Because it doesn't let you off the hook just because breaking the rule would lead to better outcomes. It doesn't care that lying to the murderer at the door saves your friend's life. It cares that lying violates a principle you couldn't universalize. That it treats the murderer, evil as he is, as less than a rational being with dignity. You might be recoiling right now. You might be thinking this is insane. That saving a life is obviously more important than maintaining some abstract principle. And that reaction is understandable. But Kant would ask you to consider what you're really saying. Are you saying that morality is just a tool for producing good outcomes? And if so, who decides what counts as good? What stops morality from becoming whatever the powerful say it is, whatever produces the results they want? Kant believes that without principles that hold, regardless of consequences, morality has no anchor. It becomes pure calculation, and calculation can justify anything if the numbers come out right. Kant's third formulation ties this together. Act as if you were a legislator in a kingdom of ends. Imagine a community of perfectly rational beings, each respecting every other as an end in themselves. each following only those principles they could will to be universal laws. That's the moral ideal. And every action you take should be something you could defend before that community. Something consistent with treating everyone, including yourself, as having unconditional worth. This is the architecture of Kant's system. Morality grounded in reason. Duties that are absolute. Principles that don't bend for consequences. Human dignity that is inviolable. It's rigorous, it's uncompromising, and it demands something from you that feels almost impossible. To act not from inclination, not from desire, not from fear or hope or love, but from duty alone. To do the right thing because it's right, even when everything in you wants to do otherwise. And here's what makes it powerful. Here's why Kant's ideas have endured. Because, when you follow his system, you can hold your head high. You can know that you haven't betrayed your principles, that you haven't treated anyone as less than human, that you've acted with integrity. You become autonomous in the deepest sense, governing yourself according to laws you've given yourself through reason. You become, in Kant's terms, truly free. But there's a cost. There's always a cost. And we'll see what that cost is when we turn to Mill. When we see what Kant's system might be missing, what it might be sacrificing on the altar of principle. For now, just understand this. Kant built something magnificent and terrifying. A moral system that asks you to be more than human, to rise above inclination and consequence, and act as pure reason would demand. Whether that's liberating or crushing depends on where you stand. Part 4. Mill's Calculus of Human Flourishing. Now step into a different world. A world that doesn't start with abstract reason but with concrete experience. A world that doesn't ask what principles rational beings must follow but what actually makes human life better or worse. This is Mill's territory, and it operates on completely different assumptions. Where Kant built upward from pure reason, Mill builds outward from observable facts about human nature. Where Kant sought certainty in universal laws, Mill seeks guidance in the patterns of pleasure and pain that govern our lives. At the foundation of Mill's ethics is a simple, almost brutally simple claim. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness, Mill means pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, he means pain and the privation of pleasure. This is utilitarianism in its most direct form. And if it sounds obvious, almost banal, that's because Mill is deliberately starting with something undeniable. Something everyone, regardless of their philosophy, seems to care about. You seek pleasure. You avoid pain. So does everyone else. This isn't a theory. It's an observation. And Mill takes this observation and builds an entire moral system on it. If pleasure is what we value, if happiness is what we pursue, then morality must be about maximizing it. Not just for you, not just for people you care about, but for everyone affected by your actions. The greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's the principle. That's the measuring stick against which every action, every rule, every institution must be judged. But Mill isn't crude about this. He's not saying all pleasures are equal. He's not reducing human flourishing to simple sensory gratification. In fact, one of his most important contributions is the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Some pleasures, Mill argues, are qualitatively superior to others. The pleasures of the mind, of art, of love, of intellectual achievement, these are worth more than mere physical pleasures. Not just because they last longer or have better consequences, but because they engage higher human capacities. Mill's famous line captures this. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig disagrees, That's because they only know their own side of the question. The person who has experienced both kinds of pleasure, who knows what it's like to enjoy both physical comfort and intellectual beauty, will always prefer the higher pleasures. They might come with more pain, more difficulty, more existential weight, but they're worth it. They make life worth living in a way that simple pleasure-seeking never could. This distinction is crucial because it shows that Mill isn't a hedonist in any shallow sense. He's not saying you should just maximize pleasure like you're optimizing dopamine hits. He's saying human happiness is complex, multi-layered, and that morality must account for this complexity. It must recognize that some ways of living are objectively better than others. Not because an abstract principle says so, but because people who have experienced both consistently choose one over the other. So how do you apply this? How do you actually use the greatest happiness principle to make moral decisions? Mill's answer is surprisingly practical. You look at the likely consequences of your actions. You consider who will be affected, how they'll be affected, and to what degree. You add up the pleasures and pains, weighing quality as well as quantity, and you choose the action that produces the best overall outcome, the most happiness for the most people. Notice what this means. It means that no action is inherently wrong. Lying, stealing, even killing, none of these are absolutely forbidden. What matters is the context, the consequences, the total impact on human welfare. Sometimes lying increases overall happiness. Sometimes breaking a promise serves the greater good. Sometimes violating what looks like a moral duty is actually the most moral thing you can do, because it prevents greater suffering. This is where Mill directly contradicts Kant. Where Kant says the rightness of an action depends on the principle behind it, Mill says it depends entirely on the results. Where Kant says you must never treat people merely as means, Mill says if using someone as a means maximizes overall happiness, you might be obligated to do it. Where Kant says some things are absolutely forbidden regardless of consequences, Mill says there are no such absolutes. There's only the calculus of welfare. But Mill isn't advocating chaos. He's not saying everyone should constantly be calculating consequences from scratch. That would be exhausting and impractical. Instead, Mill argues that we should follow general rules most of the time. Rules like don't lie, don't steal, keep your promises. Because these rules generally promote happiness. They're tested by human experience. They're encoded in our moral traditions because they work. They produce good outcomes more often than not. These rules are what Mill calls secondary principles. They're incredibly useful. They give us moral guidance without requiring constant calculation. And in most situations, following them is exactly what utilitarianism requires. But, and this is critical, they're not sacred. They're not absolute. They're tools, and when following a rule clearly produces more harm than good, when the specific circumstances make adherence counterproductive, you set the rule aside. You do what actually maximizes happiness, even if it violates the conventional moral code. This is rule utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism, and Mill walks a careful line between them. He wants the stability and practicality of rules while preserving the ultimate authority of consequences. He wants you to respect moral traditions while remaining willing to question them when they fail to serve human welfare. And this brings us to what makes Mill's system attractive. It's flexible, it's responsive to reality. It doesn't demand that you sacrifice human well-being for the sake of abstract principles. It doesn't tell you to let your friend die to avoid telling a lie. It acknowledges that morality exists for us, for human beings trying to live good lives in a complex world, not the other way round. We're not here to serve morality. Morality is here to serve us, to help us minimize suffering and maximize flourishing. Mill also gives you a framework for moral progress. Because if morality is about promoting happiness, then as we learn more about what actually makes people happy, what actually reduces suffering, our moral understanding can evolve. We can recognize that slavery is wrong. Not because it violates some timeless principle, though it does that too, but because it causes immense suffering. We can recognize that denying women rights is wrong because it prevents half of humanity from flourishing. We can reform institutions, change laws, challenge traditions, all in service of the greatest happiness principle. This is empowering. It means morality isn't frozen in stone. It means you can look at the world, see suffering, and ask, how can we reduce this? What changes would make things better? And you can advocate for those changes without needing to prove they align with some abstract rational principle. You just need to show they increase well-being, but you feel it already, don't you? You feel the unease creeping in. Because if morality is just about maximizing happiness, what happens when that calculation demands something terrible? What happens when the math says you should sacrifice an innocent person to save 5? What happens when promoting the greatest happiness requires violating individual rights, trampling on dignity, treating people as nothing more than units in a utilitarian equation? Mill has built something powerful and practical. But, like Kant's cathedral, it has its own costs, its own dangers. And we need to see both clearly before we can judge which system, if either, deserves our allegiance. Part 5. The collision of worlds. Now you see them both. Two complete systems. Two different answers to the same fundamental question. And the distance between them is vast, unbridgeable in certain ways. This isn't just a disagreement about details. This is a clash of entire moral universes, each internally consistent, each compelling in its own way, and each utterly incompatible with the other at the deepest level. Start with what they agree on. Both Kant and Mill reject divine command theory. Neither grounds morality in God's will or religious revelation. Both believe human beings can discover moral truth through natural faculties, reason for Kant, experience for Mill. Both believe in moral universalism, the idea that moral principles apply to all human beings, not just members of your tribe or nation or culture. Both take morality seriously as a systematic field of inquiry worthy of rigorous philosophical investigation. Both believe in human dignity and the possibility of moral progress. But that's where the convergence ends. Because when you look at how they define rightness, how they determine what makes an action moral, you find complete opposition. For Kant, an action is right if it conforms to the categorical imperative. If the maxim behind it can be universalized without contradiction, if it treats humanity as an end and not merely as a means, the consequences are irrelevant. What matters is the principle, the intention, the respect for rational agency. For Mill, an action is right if it maximizes overall happiness, if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number. The principle behind it is irrelevant, except as a rough guide. What matters is the outcome, the actual impact on human welfare. This creates a fundamental divide in how they approach moral dilemmas. Take that murderer at the door, again. Kant says you must tell the truth. The categorical imperative demands it. To lie, even to save a life, is to corrupt the foundation of morality. To make an exception for yourself that you couldn't universalize. Mill says you must lie. The greatest happiness principle demands it. To tell the truth, even to uphold a principle, is to cause preventable death, to sacrifice actual human well-being for abstract consistency. Who's right? Both, in a sense, and neither, in another. Because they're playing different games, using different scorecards, measuring rightness by completely different standards. From within Kant's system, Mill's willingness to lie looks like moral cowardice, a failure to stand by principle when it's difficult. From within Mill's system, Kant's refusal to lie looks like moral rigidity, a willingness to let people die for the sake of philosophical purity. Or consider the classic trolley problem. A runaway trolley is heading toward 5 people who will die unless you pull a lever to divert it onto another track where it will kill 1 person instead. What do you do? Mill's answer is clear. Pull the lever. 5 deaths are worse than 1 death. The calculation is simple. The greatest happiness principle demands that you minimize loss of life. Kant's answer is more complicated. If you're just letting the trolley stay on its current course, you're not treating anyone merely as a means. The deaths would be tragic, but not your moral responsibility in the same way. But if you actively divert it, you're using that 1 person as a means to save the 5. You're killing them to achieve a goal. And that, Kant would argue, violates their dignity as a rational being. Now, make it harder. Imagine you're on a bridge above the track. The only way to stop the trolley and save the 5 is to push a large person off the bridge onto the track. Their body will stop the trolley, but they'll die. Mill's answer might still be, do it. 5 lives outweigh 1. The math hasn't changed. But something feels different now, doesn't it? You're not just redirecting a threat. You're actively using someone's body as an object, as a tool to stop the trolley. And this is precisely where Kant's principle shines. It captures something important about the moral difference between these scenarios, something that pure consequentialism struggles to explain. Why does it feel so much worse to push someone than to pull a lever, even if the outcome is numerically identical? Kant would say it's because pushing someone off a bridge treats them as nothing but a means. It reduces them to a physical object. It denies their status as a rational agent deserving of respect. Mill might respond that this feeling is just a vestige of our moral intuitions, which are shaped by rules that usually promote happiness but don't always apply in extreme cases. That in this specific scenario, the consequences are what matter, and our squeamishness about pushing is an emotional bias we should overcome in service of the greater good. And here's the thing. Both arguments make sense within their own frameworks. You can't definitively prove one is right and the other wrong because they're starting from different foundational assumptions about what morality fundamentally is. Is morality about respecting rational agency and maintaining principled consistency, or is it about promoting welfare and reducing suffering? Your answer to that question determines which system you'll find more convincing. This extends to how they think about rights. Kant gives you a robust theory of rights grounded in human dignity. Every person has rights that can't be violated, even for the greater good, because those rights flow from their status as rational beings. You can't torture 1 person to extract information that would save 100, not because the calculation doesn't work out, but because that person's dignity is inviolable. Their rights aren't contingent on consequences. Mill's approach to rights is more instrumental. Rights are extremely important, yes, but ultimately because respecting rights tends to promote overall happiness. Security, freedom, autonomy, these things contribute massively to human well-being, so we should protect rights very strongly. But if violating a right would clearly produce much greater happiness than respecting it, then utilitarianism might demand we violate it. Rights become very strong rules of thumb rather than absolute boundaries. You can see why this matters. In a Kantian world, there are things you simply cannot do to people, no matter what. In a Millian world, there are things you generally shouldn't do to people. But the generally is doing important work. It means there might be exceptions. And those exceptions, however rare, represent a fundamental philosophical difference about the nature of morality and human dignity. Even their conception of moral agency differs. For Kant, what makes you a moral agent is your rationality, your capacity to recognize and follow universal laws. Moral worth comes from acting from duty, from doing the right thing because it's right, not because it benefits you or makes you happy. The shopkeeper who's honest because honesty is good for business has no moral worth, even though his action is correct. Only the shopkeeper who's honest from respect for the moral law, who would remain honest even if it cost him everything, has true moral worth. Mill sees this as bizarre. Why should your motivation matter if the outcome is the same? The person who volunteers at a soup kitchen because it makes them feel good is doing just as much good as the person who does it from abstract duty. Probably more, actually, because they're more likely to keep doing it. For Mill, morality should be about encouraging behavior that increases happiness, and it doesn't matter much whether that behavior comes from duty or inclination or self-interest. These aren't minor differences. These are foundational divergences about what morality is for, what it's trying to accomplish, and how we should think about right and wrong. And as you stand here, looking at both systems, you might feel torn, because each captures something real, something important. Kant captures the sense that some things are sacred, that human dignity matters beyond its contribution to overall welfare, that principles can't just be abandoned whenever the calculation shifts. Mill captures the sense that morality has to be practical, that it exists to make lives better, that rigid adherence to rules is pointless if it produces worse outcomes than breaking them. So what do you do? How do you navigate between these incompatible visions? The honest answer is that philosophers have been trying to figure that out for centuries, and they still haven't reached consensus. But before we can even approach that question, we need to see how these systems work in practice. We need to test them against real situations, real moral challenges, and see where each one shines and where each one stumbles. Part 6. When Kant walks into reality, let's put Kant's system to work. Let's see what happens when you try to live by the categorical imperative in a world that doesn't care about your principles. A world that's messy and complicated and full of situations where duty seems to demand the impossible. Start with something personal. You're caring for an elderly parent who's dying of cancer. The pain is unbearable. They beg you to help them end their life. They're suffering with no hope of recovery, and they want to die with dignity on their own terms. What does Kant say? Kant says you cannot help them. Suicide violates the categorical imperative. The maxim would be something like, when life becomes burdensome, end it. But can you universalize this? Can you will that everyone, when faced with suffering, should kill themselves? No, because this contradicts the purpose of life itself, which includes the capacity to endure and overcome difficulties. To end life merely because it's difficult is to treat yourself as a means to escaping pain, rather than as an end worthy of respect, even in suffering. And for you to help your parent kill themselves, that's worse. That's treating them as a means, complying with a decision that violates their own rational nature. Your duty is to comfort them, to ease their suffering as much as possible, but not to help them destroy themselves. Now, you might find this answer monstrous. You might think Kant is asking you to watch your parent suffer needlessly, to prioritize an abstract principle over the concrete reality of unbearable pain. And many people would agree with you. But Kant would ask, what's the alternative? If we allow suicide and assisted suicide whenever someone is suffering, where does it end? What about people who are depressed but could recover? What about people under pressure from family members who don't want the burden of care? Once you make killing permissible based on a calculation of suffering, you've opened a door that's hard to close. You've said that some lives aren't worth living, that some people would be better off dead. And that's a judgment Kant refuses to make. or consider truth-telling in less extreme cases. You're hiding refugees in your basement during a genocide. Soldiers come to your door and ask if you're hiding anyone. Kant says you must tell the truth. You must say yes, even though it means the refugees will be killed. Even though lying would save innocent lives. Because to lie is to violate the categorical imperative, to make an exception for yourself that you couldn't universalize. If everyone lied whenever they thought the consequences justified it, truth-telling would collapse as an institution. Trust would be impossible. Society would fracture. And here's where Kant's system starts to feel alien, almost inhuman. Because, from the outside, it looks like he's valuing abstract consistency over human lives. It looks like he's so committed to principle that he's lost sight of what morality is supposed to be for. How can it be moral to cooperate with genocide for the sake of honesty? How can that possibly be the right thing to do? Kant's defenders would respond that you're not responsible for what the soldiers do with the truth. You're only responsible for your own actions, your own adherence to moral law. If you lie, you've done wrong, regardless of the outcome. If you tell the truth and terrible things happen, that's tragic, but it's not your moral failing. You've maintained your integrity. You've respected the moral law. And in the long run, in the aggregate, societies where people consistently tell the truth will be better than societies where lying is acceptable whenever someone thinks it will produce good results. But this feels cold, doesn't it? It feels like Kant is asking you to wash your hands of responsibility for foreseeable consequences. If you know that telling the truth will get people killed, how can you claim you're not responsible when they die? Mill would say you absolutely are responsible. You're responsible for what you could have prevented. And choosing principle over lives isn't noble. It's cowardice dressed up as moral purity. Let's try another domain. Criminal justice. You're a judge. A crime has been committed, and the community is outraged. You know the defendant is innocent, but you also know that if you don't convict them, there will be riots. People will die. Property will be destroyed. The community will tear itself apart. What does Kant say? Kant says you cannot convict an innocent person. To do so would be to treat them merely as a means to social stability. It would violate their dignity as a rational being. Their innocence means they have a right not to be punished. And that right doesn't evaporate, because punishing them would produce better consequences. Justice demands that you acquit them, even if it leads to chaos, even if more people suffer as a result. Because the principle of punishing only the guilty is more fundamental than the calculus of overall welfare. And again, from within Kant's system, this makes perfect sense. If you can convict innocent people whenever it serves the greater good, then nobody's rights mean anything. Everyone becomes a potential sacrifice on the altar of utility. But from outside the system, it looks like Kant is willing to let the world burn rather than compromise on principle. Like he's choosing theoretical purity over practical wisdom. Here's the deeper problem with Kant's system when it meets reality. It gives you almost no guidance on what to do when duties conflict. What do you do when telling the truth violates someone's dignity? When keeping a promise causes harm to others? When respecting one person's autonomy means failing to protect someone else? Kant's categorical imperative tells you that certain things are always wrong. But it doesn't help you navigate situations where every option seems to violate some duty. You're a doctor with one dose of life-saving medicine and two patients who need it equally. If you give it to one, the other dies. If you try to split it, both die. What's your duty? Kant offers no clear answer. The categorical imperative doesn't tell you how to choose between two people who both deserve treatment. It just tells you that you can't treat either of them merely as a means. But in choosing one, aren't you inevitably treating the other's life as less important? Aren't you making a calculation that Kant's system supposedly forbids? Or you're a parent with limited resources. You can either pay for your child's education or donate the money to save 10 children from starvation. What does duty demand? Kant emphasizes special obligations, the duties we have to those close to us. But he also emphasizes the universal dignity of all rational beings. So, do you prioritize your child or treat all children equally? The system doesn't clearly resolve this. These aren't just theoretical problems. These are real limitations that show up when you try to actually live by Kantian principles. And the limitation isn't that Kant's system is wrong, exactly. It's that it's incomplete. It tells you what you cannot do, the principles you cannot violate. But it gives you less help in deciding what you should do when all your options involve some violation, or when you're facing a choice between goods rather than between good and evil. Still, there's something powerful here, something that Mill's system lacks. When you follow Kant, when you refuse to compromise on principle even when it's hard, you're making a statement about what you believe. You're saying that some things matter more than outcomes. That integrity, dignity, and moral law aren't negotiable. That you won't become a different person just because circumstances change. And there's a strength in that, a kind of moral backbone that purely consequentialist thinking can erode. You know you'll never lie, never use people, never violate their fundamental rights, no matter what. And that consistency, that reliability, that refusal to become an instrument of utilitarian calculation, it means something. It creates a kind of person who can be trusted absolutely, who won't betray principles when it's convenient, who stands for something permanent in a world of shifting circumstances. But the cost is real. The cost is flexibility, pragmatism, responsiveness to the specific details of situations. The cost is sometimes watching bad outcomes unfold because your hands are tied by principle. And whether that cost is worth paying depends on what you think morality is ultimately for. Part 7. When Mill meets the moral edge, now turn to Mill. Let's see what happens when you make consequences the sole arbiter of right and wrong. Let's watch utilitarianism work in the world and see where its flexibility becomes wisdom and where it becomes something darker. Start with something that seems like a clear win for Mill. You're a city planner deciding how to allocate a limited budget. You can either build a hospital in a poor neighborhood where it will save many lives, or you can build a museum in a wealthy neighborhood where it will bring aesthetic pleasure to fewer people. Mill's answer is obvious. Build the hospital. The calculation isn't even close. Saving lives and reducing suffering produces vastly more happiness than providing cultural enrichment to people who already have access to it. Utilitarianism gives you a clear, defensible answer that aligns with moral intuition. Or you're deciding whether to donate money to an effective charity that provides mosquito nets in malaria-prone regions, or to your local opera house. Mill says, give to the charity. The marginal impact on human welfare is incomparably greater. Each dollar prevents more suffering, saves more lives, produces more happiness. This is utilitarianism at its best, giving you practical guidance that genuinely makes the world better. Cutting through sentimentality and tradition to focus on what actually matters, which is reducing preventable suffering. Mill's system excels at large-scale policy questions. Should we provide universal healthcare? Calculate whether the increase in overall well-being from healthier citizens outweighs the costs. Should we legalize certain drugs? Measure whether prohibition or legalization produces better outcomes in terms of health, freedom, and social stability. Should we invest in education or infrastructure? Determine which produces more long-term happiness. Utilitarianism gives policymakers a framework for making decisions that affect millions, a way to compare options and choose the one that does the most good. This is powerful. This is why utilitarian thinking dominates fields like economics and public health. Because it works. Because it takes moral questions and makes them tractable. Because it forces you to think about actual outcomes rather than getting lost in abstract principles or traditional prejudices. Mill's system is responsive, adaptable, and grounded in what we can observe and measure about human welfare. But now, let's push it. Let's see what happens when the calculus starts demanding things that make you uncomfortable. You're a surgeon. 5 patients are dying, each needing a different organ: heart, lungs, kidneys, liver. A healthy person walks into your clinic for a routine checkup. You could kill them, harvest their organs, and save 5 lives. The math is simple. 5 lives outweigh 1. The greatest happiness principle seems to demand that you kill the healthy patient. You recoil. Obviously, you shouldn't do this. But why not? If utilitarianism is true, if morality really is just about maximizing happiness, why is this wrong? Mill would say it's wrong because of the broader consequences. If doctors started killing healthy patients for organs, nobody would trust hospitals. People would avoid medical care. The entire healthcare system would collapse. The long-term decrease in happiness would far outweigh the short-term gain of saving 5 people. But notice what's happened. Mill has to invoke these indirect consequences to explain why an act that seems obviously wrong is actually wrong. And what if you could keep it secret? What if nobody would ever find out? What if there were no ripple effects? No erosion of trust, just 5 people saved at the cost of 1. Does the action become right then? Pure act utilitarianism seems to say yes. And that's deeply disturbing. Mill tries to escape this by emphasizing rules, by saying we should generally follow principles like don't kill innocent people because those rules promote happiness in the aggregate. But the word generally is doing enormous work. It means there are exceptions. And once you start making exceptions, once you say that rules can be violated when the calculation demands it, you're on a slippery slope. Who decides when the exception applies? How do you prevent abuse? How do you maintain moral boundaries if those boundaries can be crossed whenever someone thinks the numbers work out? Consider torture. A terrorist has planted a bomb that will kill thousands. You've captured them, but they won't reveal the location. Do you torture them? Utilitarianism seems to say yes. Thousands of lives outweigh 1 person's suffering. The greatest happiness principle demands that you extract the information by whatever means necessary. And yet, something in you resists. Something says that torturing someone is wrong regardless of the consequences. That there are things we simply don't do to human beings. That the moment you start calculating whether to torture someone, you've already lost something essential. Mill might respond that torture is wrong because it rarely works, because it brutalizes the torturers, because it sets precedents that lead to more torture in situations where it isn't justified. But again, what if you could avoid all those problems? What if you had a magic scenario where torture would definitely work, where nobody would be traumatized, where there would be no broader social effects? Does it become permissible then? And if your answer is still no, doesn't that suggest you're appealing to something beyond consequences? Something like the Kantian idea that certain acts violate human dignity, regardless of outcomes. Here's another edge case. Imagine a society where a small minority is enslaved for the benefit of the majority. The slaves suffer enormously, but the happiness they produce for millions of others outweighs their suffering. The total happiness in this society is higher than it would be without slavery. Does utilitarianism have to endorse this? Mill would say no. because slavery violates individual liberty, which is essential to human happiness. Free people are happier than slaves, and a society that respects freedom will produce more overall well-being than one that doesn't. But this appeal to liberty is starting to look suspiciously like a principle that matters independent of consequences. Mill is smuggling in values like freedom and dignity that aren't reducible to happiness. He's saying some things matter even if they don't maximize the utilitarian calculus. And once he does that, he's no longer a pure utilitarian. He's acknowledging that there are constraints on how we can pursue happiness, that we can't just sacrifice anyone and anything in service of the greatest good. The problem gets worse when you consider distribution. Utilitarianism cares about total or average happiness, but it doesn't inherently care about how that happiness is distributed. If you can produce the same total happiness by making 10 people moderately happy, or by making 1 person ecstatic and 9 people miserable, utilitarianism is indifferent. It doesn't care about fairness or equality except insofar as those things contribute to overall welfare. And this feels wrong. We think it matters not just how much happiness exists, but how it's spread, who gets it, whether people are being treated equitably. Mill tries to address this by arguing that equality generally promotes happiness because inequality breeds resentment and instability. But again, what if it doesn't? What if you have a society where the oppressed have been so thoroughly conditioned that they don't resent their oppression? Where inequality is stable and accepted? Does injustice become acceptable then? Utilitarianism struggles to say no without appealing to principles beyond happiness maximization. And then there's the problem of preference satisfaction. Mill says happiness is what people value, so we should maximize it. But people value different things. Some people find happiness in simple pleasures. Others find it in achievement, beauty, truth, virtue. Some people's preferences are cruel or destructive. How do you aggregate all these different conceptions of the good life into a single measure? How do you compare the happiness of a sadist who takes pleasure in others' pain with the happiness of a saint? Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures helps, but it's not clear how to apply it systematically. And it suggests that some expert has to judge which pleasures are worth more, which starts to look paternalistic. Moreover, utilitarianism seems to demand too much. If morality is about maximizing happiness, then you're always obligated to do whatever produces the most good. Spending money on yourself when you could donate it to save lives becomes immoral. Pursuing your own projects when you could be helping others becomes immoral. There's no space for personal pursuits, for special relationships, for living your own life according to your own values. You become a servant of the utilitarian calculus, always calculating, always sacrificing, never permitted to just be. Mill acknowledges this problem and tries to soften it, arguing that people need personal time and relationships to be happy, so permitting them serves the greater good. But this feels ad hoc. It's utilitarianism trying to accommodate our intuitions rather than following its logic wherever it leads. And if you're going to start making exceptions to preserve common sense morality, why be a utilitarian in the first place? Here's what's becoming clear. Mill's system gives you flexibility and responsiveness, but it also gives you instability and potential for abuse. It works beautifully for policy questions where you can measure outcomes and affect large populations. It struggles with individual moral decisions where the calculation gets murky, and where our intuitions tell us that some things matter beyond their contribution to overall happiness. Just as Kant's system is too rigid for messy reality, Mill's system might be too fluid for moral security. Part 8. The critics sharpen their knives. You've seen both systems from the inside. You've watched them work and watched them stumble. Now, it's time to hear from their critics, from the philosophers and thinkers who've spent centuries poking holes in these frameworks, testing them against edge cases, revealing their hidden assumptions and unacknowledged costs. Because no moral theory, no matter how brilliant, escapes criticism. And the criticisms leveled against Kant and Mill are devastating in their own ways. Let's start with the attacks on Kant. The first line of criticism is brutally simple. Kant's system is too abstract, too divorced from human psychology and the actual conditions of moral life. Bernard Williams, a 20th-century philosopher, argued that Kant asks the impossible. He demands that you act from duty alone, setting aside all inclination, all emotion, all personal attachment. But human beings aren't like that. We're not pure, rational agents. We're embodied creatures with loves and loyalties, with projects and commitments that give our lives meaning. Williams asks, what kind of person would save their drowning spouse only because it's their duty, not because they love them? What kind of person treats their children well purely from respect for the categorical imperative rather than from affection? Kant's ideal moral agent starts to look inhuman, emotionally stunted, incapable of the very relationships that make life worth living. And if your ethical system requires you to become something other than recognizably human to fully embody it, maybe the problem is with the system, not with humanity. Moreover, Kant's claim that moral worth only comes from acting from duty seems perverse. If you help someone because it makes you feel good, because you care about them, because their well-being matters to you, Kant says your action has no moral worth. Only if you help them, despite not caring, only if you're motivated purely by duty, does your action count as truly moral. This seems backwards. Surely someone who spontaneously helps others from compassion is more admirable than someone who has to force themselves to do the right thing against their inclinations. Then there's the problem of moral rigorism. Kant's absolute rules, his refusal to allow exceptions even when consequences are catastrophic, strikes many critics as fanatical. Christine Korsgaard, a Kantian herself, has wrestled with this problem. How can it be right to let terrible things happen when you could prevent them with a simple lie? How can respect for moral law trump respect for human life? Critics argue that Kant has mistaken consistency for correctness, that he's built a beautiful logical structure that's fundamentally disconnected from what morality is supposed to accomplish, which is making the world better and reducing suffering. There's also the problem of application. Kant says to universalize your maxims, but how do you formulate the maxim in the first place? The same action can be described in different ways, and depending on how you describe it, the universalization test gives different results. Take lying to the murderer. If your maxim is lie whenever it's convenient, that can't be universalized. But if your maxim is lie to prevent murder, maybe it can be. Who decides which description is correct? Kant doesn't give clear guidance, which means the categorical imperative becomes less like an objective test and more like a framework that requires judgment and interpretation, undermining its claim to provide certain, universal moral knowledge. Furthermore, critics point out that Kant's system handles conflicts of duty poorly. What do you do when two categorical imperatives clash? When telling the truth violates someone's dignity? When respecting one person's autonomy means failing to protect another? Kant offers no clear hierarchy of duties, no method for resolving these conflicts. He just insists that both duties are absolute, which is useless when you're forced to choose. And perhaps most damningly, critics argue that Kant's focus on intention rather than outcome is morally irresponsible. You're accountable for what you do, not just what you intended. If your adherence to principle causes foreseeable harm, you can't just wash your hands of it by saying you had good intentions. The person who tells the truth to the murderer bears some moral responsibility when the victim dies. To deny this is to embrace a kind of moral narcissism, caring more about your own purity than about the actual consequences of your actions in the world. Now turn the critical lens on Mill. The attacks on utilitarianism are equally fierce, and they cut at the foundation of consequentialist thinking. The first major criticism is that utilitarianism can justify terrible acts. We've already seen this. If the calculus works out, you should torture, kill innocents, violate rights, sacrifice the few for the many. Mill tries to escape by arguing that these acts would have bad long-term consequences, but critics point out this is empirical hand-waving. It's not obvious that every rights violation would have net negative consequences. And if Mill's defense of rights depends entirely on contingent empirical claims about human psychology and social stability, then rights become fragile, contingent, revocable whenever the numbers change. John Rawls, one of the 20th century's most influential political philosophers, argued that utilitarianism doesn't take seriously the distinction between persons. It treats everyone's happiness as fungible, as interchangeable units in a sum. But people aren't just vessels for happiness. We're separate individuals with our own lives, our own projects, our own boundaries. You can't just aggregate happiness across persons the way you aggregate wealth in a bank account. My suffering and your joy don't cancel out in some cosmic ledger. They're separate facts about separate people. And a moral theory that treats them as interchangeable is fundamentally disrespecting the separateness of persons. This connects to the problem of justice. Utilitarianism seems unable to account for our intuitions about fairness and desert. If punishing an innocent person maximizes happiness, utilitarianism says do it. If enslaving a minority benefits the majority enough, utilitarianism struggles to condemn it. If breaking a promise produces better outcomes, the promise means nothing. Critics argue that these aren't just edge cases. They reveal a fundamental flaw. Utilitarianism can't explain why justice, fairness, and individual rights matter, except as instruments for maximizing welfare. And that gets it backwards. These things matter intrinsically, not just because they tend to produce good consequences. Then there's the measurement problem. How do you actually calculate the greatest happiness? How do you measure pleasure and pain across different people with different sensitivities? How do you compare the happiness of existing people with potential future people? How do you weight quality against quantity, duration against intensity? Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures doesn't solve this. It makes it worse by requiring some authority to judge which pleasures are qualitatively better, and who gets to make that judgment. Mill says anyone who's experienced both will prefer the higher pleasures, but this is demonstrably false. Plenty of educated, experienced people choose simple pleasures over intellectual ones. Are they wrong? Is Mill saying they don't understand their own happiness? Critics also point out that utilitarianism is self-effacing. It might tell you not to think like a utilitarian. If constantly calculating consequences makes you anxious, indecisive, and less effective at promoting happiness, then utilitarianism itself says you should stop being a utilitarian in your day-to-day thinking. You should adopt rules, virtues, or character traits that reliably produce good outcomes without requiring constant calculation. But this is strange. What kind of moral theory tells you not to use it? It suggests that utilitarianism might be a criterion of rightness, but not a decision procedure, which raises the question of what role it's supposed to play in moral life. Moreover, there's the demandingness objection, which we've touched on but deserves more attention. If you're always obligated to maximize happiness, you're never permitted to pursue your own projects, develop your own talents, or maintain your own relationships except insofar as they contribute to the greater good, you become a utility-maximizing machine. Every dollar you spend on yourself that could have saved a life in the developing world is immoral. Every hour you spend on hobbies instead of volunteering is immoral. The theory demands complete self-sacrifice, and that's not just impractical, it's dehumanizing. It denies the legitimacy of your own life as something worth living for its own sake. Peter Singer has embraced this conclusion, arguing that we really are obligated to give most of our wealth away and dedicate our lives to reducing suffering. But most people, including most philosophers, think this is too demanding. They think morality needs to leave space for personal pursuits. Mill tries to accommodate this by saying personal happiness contributes to overall happiness, but this is unconvincing. If you could do more good helping others, utilitarianism seems to demand that you do so. Finally, critics argue that utilitarianism reduces all value to a single metric, happiness or welfare. But human life is more complex than that. We value beauty, truth, justice, achievement, love, autonomy, and many other goods that aren't reducible to pleasure or happiness. A life spent experiencing pleasant illusions in an experience machine isn't as valuable as a life engaged with reality, even if it contains the same amount of subjective happiness. Utilitarianism struggles to explain why. It has to either deny that these other values matter intrinsically, or try to fold them into an expanded concept of happiness that becomes so broad it loses its clarity. So here's where we are. Kant's system is criticized for being too rigid, too abstract, too demanding in its requirement for pure duty, too disconnected from consequences and human psychology. Mill's system is criticized for being too flexible, too willing to sacrifice individuals for collective benefit, too reductive in its focus on happiness, too unable to ground justice and rights. The critics have exposed genuine weaknesses in both frameworks. Neither system emerges unscathed. And this raises the question, is there a synthesis? Is there a way to take the strengths of both while avoiding their weaknesses? Or are we stuck choosing between imperfect options? Part 9, where each system truly shines. Before we try to answer that question, we need to be fair. We need to see where each framework genuinely excels, where it offers something the other cannot match. Because, for all their flaws, both Kant and Mill built systems that capture something true and important about morality. And dismissing either one entirely would be a mistake. Kant's system shines brightest when you're thinking about human dignity and the inviolability of persons. When you need a framework that says some things are absolutely off the table, no matter what. When you need to protect individuals from being sacrificed for the collective good. This is where Kantian ethics becomes not just attractive but essential. Think about human rights. Why can't we torture someone even if it would save lives? Why can't we enslave a minority even if it would benefit the majority? Why can't we harvest organs from unwilling donors even if it would save more people than it kills? The utilitarian answers to these questions are always contingent, always dependent on empirical claims about long-term consequences and social stability. But the Kantian answer is rock solid, because it violates human dignity, because it treats persons as mere means, because rational beings have inherent worth that cannot be traded away for any consequence, no matter how beneficial. This is powerful. This is why the language of human rights, the idea that every person possesses dignity that must be respected, has become the dominant moral framework in international law and discourse. It comes straight from Kant, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Geneva Conventions, the philosophical foundation for opposing genocide, slavery, and tyranny. All of this rests on essentially Kantian ideas. The notion that there are moral boundaries that cannot be crossed, that some acts are inherently wrong regardless of their consequences, that every human being deserves respect simply by virtue of being human. This is Kant's legacy. Kant also gives you moral clarity and consistency. When you adopt his framework, you know where you stand. You're not constantly recalculating based on shifting circumstances. You have principles that hold firm. This creates a kind of moral character that's admirable and trustworthy. You become someone who can be relied upon, who won't abandon their commitments when it's convenient, who treats moral obligations as genuine constraints rather than as suggestions to be followed when the math works out. There's something dignified about this, something that preserves your integrity even in the face of terrible consequences. When you refuse to lie, even to save a life, you're making a statement about what kind of person you are. You're saying that you won't compromise your principles, that there are lines you won't cross. And while this can look like moral fanaticism from the outside, it can also look like strength, like an unwillingness to let circumstances determine your character. Kant's emphasis on autonomy is also crucial. He recognizes that being moral isn't just about following rules imposed from outside. It's about giving yourself the moral law, about governing yourself according to principles you've rationally endorsed. This makes morality compatible with freedom. You're not a slave to duty. You're free precisely when you act according to rational moral principles, because those principles come from your own rational nature. This is a profound insight about the relationship between freedom and morality, one that's shaped modern political philosophy and our understanding of what it means to be a self-governing individual. Moreover, Kant's system is theoretically elegant. It derives everything from a single principle, the categorical imperative. It's systematic, rigorous, and intellectually satisfying in a way that more eclectic approaches aren't. For someone who values philosophical coherence, who wants their ethics to be grounded in reason rather than intuition or tradition or sentiment, Kant offers something unmatched. But now turn to Mill. Look at where utilitarianism excels, where it provides insights and guidance that Kantianism cannot match. Mill's system shines when you're trying to make the world actually better, when you need to compare policies, evaluate institutions, or decide how to allocate resources, when you need a framework that's responsive to empirical evidence and focused on reducing real suffering. This is where consequentialism becomes not just useful but indispensable. Consider public health policy. You have limited resources. How do you decide whether to invest in cancer research or infectious disease prevention? How do you determine which treatments to fund, which interventions to prioritize? Kantian ethics doesn't give you tools for this. It tells you to respect everyone's dignity, but it doesn't tell you how to make trade-offs when you can't help everyone equally. Utilitarianism does. It tells you to maximize health outcomes, to save the most lives, to reduce the most suffering. It gives you a framework for making difficult decisions that have enormous real-world impact. Or think about criminal justice reform. Should we reduce sentences for non-violent drug offenses? Should we invest in rehabilitation or punishment? Should we abolish the death penalty? Utilitarianism tells you to look at the evidence. Does rehabilitation reduce recidivism? Does harsh sentencing deter crime? What actually produces better outcomes in terms of public safety and human welfare? This evidence-based, outcome-focused approach has driven some of the most important moral progress in criminal justice, moving us away from retributive systems that increase suffering toward restorative ones that actually work. Mill's framework is also better at handling moral progress and cultural variation. Because it's based on consequences rather than absolute principles, it can recognize that different situations might call for different rules. It can acknowledge that moral understanding evolves as we learn more about what promotes human welfare. It can explain why slavery and patriarchy, once accepted, are now recognized as wrong. Not because we discovered some eternal truth we'd been blind to, but because we came to understand how much suffering these institutions caused and recognized better alternatives. This adaptability is crucial. Kant's system, with its absolute duties derived from pure reason, struggles to account for moral progress. If the moral law is eternal and unchanging, how do we explain that moral consensus on issues like slavery, women's rights, and animal welfare has changed dramatically? Mill can say, we've learned more about what causes suffering and what promotes welfare, so our moral understanding has improved. Kant has to say, either that people were irrational before, or that these changes aren't really moral progress, just changing applications of eternal principles. Neither answer is fully satisfying. Mill also respects the plurality of human values and ways of life. His distinction between higher and lower pleasures acknowledges that people find fulfillment in different ways. As long as you're not harming others, as long as you're contributing to overall welfare, you're free to pursue your own conception of the good life. This pluralism, this respect for individual choice within a framework of not harming others, has been foundational for liberal political philosophy. It's why Mill's On Liberty remains one of the most important defenses of individual freedom ever written. Furthermore, utilitarianism is psychologically realistic in a way Kantianism isn't. It doesn't require you to act from duty alone, setting aside all emotion and inclination. It recognizes that compassion, empathy, and care are valuable moral motivations. If you help someone because you care about them, that's good. If it produces positive outcomes, it's morally right. Mill doesn't create a gap between being a good person and being a morally worthy person. He integrates moral worth with natural human emotions and relationships, and there's something deeply intuitive about consequentialism. When you're trying to decide what to do, of course you think about outcomes. Of course you consider who will be affected and how. Of course you try to make things better rather than worse. This isn't some alien moral framework imposed from outside. It's a systematization of reasoning you already do. Mill just asks you to do it more carefully, more impartially, more focused on overall welfare rather than just your own interests. The utilitarian focus on reducing suffering has also driven tremendous moral progress. The animal welfare movement, effective altruism, global poverty reduction, all of these are fundamentally utilitarian in inspiration. They ask, where is there preventable suffering? How can we reduce it most effectively? What interventions produce the most good per dollar spent? This relentless focus on measurable outcomes, on actually making things better, has saved millions of lives and prevented enormous amounts of suffering. So you see the picture now. Kant gives you moral boundaries, dignity, rights, and principled integrity. Mill gives you flexibility, pragmatism, measurable progress, and a focus on reducing real suffering. Kant protects individuals from being sacrificed. Mill ensures that we're actually trying to make the world better. Kant provides the floor, the baseline of respect below which we cannot go. Mill provides the direction, the goal toward which we should aim. Neither is complete without the other, and yet they seem fundamentally incompatible. Part 10. Living in the Tension. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You can't fully reconcile Kant and Mill. Their systems rest on incompatible foundational assumptions. One says rightness is about principles and respect for rational agency. The other says it's about consequences and welfare maximization. One tells you there are absolute moral constraints. The other tells you everything is negotiable if the outcomes justify it. These aren't surface disagreements that clever philosophy can smooth over. They're deep, structural differences that reflect genuinely different visions of what morality is. But here's the other truth, the one that matters more for your actual life. You already live in the tension between them. You already navigate between principle and consequence, between duty and outcome, between respecting rights and promoting welfare. You do this every day, whether you realize it or not. And the question isn't which system to choose exclusively. The question is how to think clearly about the trade-offs you're already making. Consider your everyday moral life. When you keep a promise, even though breaking it would be more convenient, you're being Kantian. You're saying that principles matter, that your word means something independent of consequences. When you donate to an effective charity rather than one that makes you feel good but does less actual good, you're being Millian. You're prioritizing outcomes over intentions. When you refuse to lie to a friend, even about something small, you're upholding Kantian respect for persons. When you tell a white lie to spare someone's feelings, you're making a Millian calculation that the reduced suffering outweighs the principle of honesty. You move between these frameworks fluidly, often without conscious thought. And that's not because you're confused or inconsistent. It's because moral reality is complex enough that no single framework captures everything that matters. Kant captures something true, that persons have dignity that shouldn't be violated, that some moral boundaries are worth maintaining, that integrity and principle matter. Mill captures something equally true, that consequences matter enormously, that reducing suffering is a legitimate moral goal, that rigid adherence to rules can cause preventable harm. The task isn't to choose one and reject the other. The task is to understand both deeply enough that you know which framework applies when, and to recognize the genuine dilemmas where they conflict and neither has a fully satisfying answer. Let's think about how this works in practice. In your personal relationships, Kantian thinking often dominates and should dominate. You don't use your friends merely as means to your happiness. You respect their autonomy, their dignity, their right to make their own decisions. You don't lie to them just because it would produce better short-term outcomes. You maintain trust, keep commitments, honor boundaries. These are essentially Kantian values, and they're foundational to healthy relationships. But even in personal relationships, consequences matter. If telling your friend a hard truth will destroy them at a moment when they're already fragile, maybe you wait. If keeping a secret violates someone else's rights or safety, maybe you break confidence. You're not being inconsistent. You're recognizing that multiple values are in play, and sometimes they conflict. In professional life, especially in positions of responsibility, utilitarian thinking becomes more dominant. If you're a policymaker, a doctor, a business leader, someone whose decisions affect many people, you have to think about outcomes. You have to consider which choice produces the most good, prevents the most harm, serves the most people. You can't just follow abstract principles without regard for consequences. You have to be pragmatic. You have to calculate. But even here, there are Kantian constraints. You can't torture suspects, even if it might save lives. You can't conduct medical experiments on unwilling subjects, even if the knowledge would help future patients. You can't lie to the public, even if it would prevent panic. There are boundaries, rights, principles that constrain how you pursue good outcomes. The ends don't justify all means. Some means are simply off the table. This dual framework, Kantian constraints within a broadly consequentialist approach, is actually how most modern applied ethics works. Medical ethics, for instance, operates this way. Doctors should try to maximize patient welfare, but they must also respect autonomy, maintain confidentiality, and avoid causing harm. They can't force treatment on competent adults, even if it would make them healthier. They can't violate one patient's privacy, even to benefit others. Kantian principles set the boundaries. Utilitarian thinking operates within them. The same pattern appears in legal and political philosophy. Democratic societies generally adopt a framework of rights that protect individuals from being sacrificed for collective benefit. That's Kantian. But within those constraints, policy is made by trying to promote overall welfare, reduce suffering, and increase prosperity. That's Millian. You have constitutional protections that can't be overridden even by majority vote, combined with democratic processes aimed at promoting the common good. This suggests a possible synthesis, not a theoretical one that resolves the philosophical conflict, but a practical one that acknowledges both frameworks have legitimate claims on us. Maybe morality has two levels. At one level, we have rights, duties, and principles that are relatively absolute and that protect human dignity. These are side constraints on action, boundaries you can't cross. At another level, we have consequentialist reasoning aimed at promoting welfare within those constraints. You can't violate rights to maximize happiness, but given respect for rights, you should try to make things better rather than worse. This isn't philosophically pure. Kant would object that it makes rights contingent and gives consequences too much weight. Mill would object that it makes welfare maximization subordinate to abstract principles. But it might be closer to how we actually think and should think about morality. It honors both the Kantian insight that persons matter as individuals with dignity and a Millian insight that outcomes matter and we should try to reduce suffering. There's another way to think about the relationship. Maybe Kant and Mill are addressing different questions. Kant is asking, what makes me a good person? What does it mean to have moral integrity? How should I conduct myself to maintain my dignity as a rational being? Mill is asking, what makes the world better? How should we structure society to maximize welfare? What actions produce the best outcomes for everyone? These are both legitimate questions, and their answers might not align perfectly. You can be a good person in the Kantian sense, acting from duty, respecting others, maintaining principle, while recognizing that this doesn't always produce optimal outcomes. And you can work toward the best consequences in the Millian sense while recognizing that this doesn't fully capture what it means to be morally admirable as an individual. Both questions matter. Both frameworks illuminate something important. And the tension between them is a feature of moral life, not a bug to be eliminated. Here's what this means practically. When you face a moral decision, ask yourself both questions. Ask, what principles are at stake here? What duties do I have? How can I respect the dignity and autonomy of everyone involved? That's Kant. Then ask, what are the likely consequences? Who will be affected? How can I minimize harm and maximize welfare? That's Mill. Often, both frameworks will point in the same direction. Sometimes they'll conflict, and you'll have to make a judgment call about which consideration is weightier in this specific context. This isn't moral relativism. It's not saying that anything goes or that moral truth doesn't exist. It's saying that moral reality is complex, that different moral considerations can pull in different directions, and that wisdom lies in understanding these different considerations clearly, rather than pretending one simple framework answers everything. You won't always get it right. You'll face situations where every option feels wrong, where you're torn between principle and consequence, where neither Kant nor Mill offers a fully satisfying answer. That's not failure. That's moral seriousness. That's recognizing the genuine difficulty of living well in a complex world. The people who never feel this tension are either saints or sociopaths, and you're probably neither. You're someone trying to navigate between competing goods, to honor multiple values that sometimes conflict, to be both principled and pragmatic. And that's okay. That's human. That's what moral life looks like for thoughtful people who take both integrity and consequences seriously. Part 11, the deeper philosophical question, but we need to go deeper. Because beneath the practical question of how to live with both frameworks lies a more fundamental philosophical question. What is morality itself? What are we doing when we make moral judgments? Are we discovering objective truths about how rational beings must act? Or are we expressing commitments about what kind of world we want to create? This question determines not just which ethical system you prefer, but what you think ethical systems are for in the first place. Kant believed morality was objective, universal, and knowable through reason alone. The categorical imperative isn't just his opinion or his cultural bias. It's supposed to be a truth that any rational being, anywhere, at any time, must acknowledge. Just as you can't rationally deny that 2 + 2 = 4. You can't rationally deny that you should treat humanity as an end, and never merely as a means. Morality, for Kant, is woven into the structure of rationality itself. To be rational is to recognize moral law. To violate moral law is to contradict yourself as a rational being. This is an incredibly strong claim. And it's either profoundly true or profoundly mistaken. If Kant is right, then morality has the same status as logic or mathematics. It's not something we invented or constructed. It's something we discovered. It binds us with the force of necessity. We couldn't change it even if we wanted to, any more than we could make circles, square, or contradictions true. Mill's approach is different. He grounds morality in observable facts about human nature, that we seek pleasure and avoid pain, that happiness is what we value. From this empirical foundation, he derives the principle that we should maximize happiness. But this derivation isn't purely logical. It involves a normative leap. Just because we do value happiness doesn't automatically mean we should maximize it for everyone. Mill is making a claim about what we ought to care about, not just what we happen to care about. And that claim, while intuitive to many, isn't self-evident in the way Kant's rational principles are supposed to be. This raises the question, is Mill's utilitarianism grounded in objective truth, or is it a construction, a framework we adopt because it serves certain purposes we value? Mill himself seems torn on this. Sometimes he writes as if the greatest happiness principle is an obvious truth that needs no proof. Other times he acknowledges that ultimate moral principles can't be proven. They can only be shown to be consistent with what we care about and to provide useful guidance. So which metaphysical view is correct? Is morality objective or constructed, discovered or invented? This isn't just an academic question. It shapes everything else. If Kant is right, if morality really is embedded in rationality itself, then moral disagreement is always a kind of mistake. One side is being irrational, failing to see what reason demands. Moral progress means getting better at recognizing rational truths we should have seen all along. And moral relativism is simply incoherent. There are no alternative moralities, just alternative confusions. If morality is more like Mill suggests, more grounded in human nature and aimed at human flourishing, then things are less clear-cut. Maybe different societies with different circumstances could rationally adopt different moral frameworks. Maybe moral progress is less about discovering eternal truths and more about developing better tools for promoting welfare and reducing suffering. Maybe there's more room for pluralism, for multiple valid ways of organizing ethical life. But here's where it gets interesting. Both Kant and Mill might be wrong about the foundations while being right about important aspects of their systems. Consider moral realism, the view that moral facts exist independent of what anyone thinks or wants. You could be a moral realist without being a Kantian. You could think that human dignity is an objective fact, while denying that it's grounded in pure rationality. Maybe it's grounded in the nature of consciousness, or in the intrinsic value of sentient beings, or in something else entirely. Or consider moral constructivism, the view that moral truths are constructed through rational agreement or social practices. You could be a constructivist who thinks the principles we construct look a lot like Kant's categorical imperative, because any rational beings trying to coordinate their behavior would converge on treating each other as ends rather than means. Or you could be a constructivist who thinks we should construct principles aimed at welfare maximization, because that's what we would agree to if we were thinking clearly about what we want from morality. The point is that the debate between Kant and Mill operates at multiple levels. At one level, it's about which specific principles we should follow, categorical duties or consequentialist calculation. At another level, it's about what grounds those principles, pure reason or empirical facts about welfare. At the deepest level, it's about the nature of morality itself, what we're doing when we make moral claims and what would make those claims true or false. And here's what you need to understand. You can't resolve the practical debate without taking a position on the metaphysical debate. If you think morality is objective and knowable through reason, you'll be drawn toward something like Kantianism. If you think morality is fundamentally about improving human welfare, you'll be drawn toward something like Utilitarianism. If you think morality is constructed through social agreement, you'll look for a framework that reflects what rational agents would agree to. Your deepest philosophical commitments shape which ethical system seems most plausible. But most people don't have fully worked out metaphysical views. Most people, including most moral philosophers, operate with a mix of intuitions that don't perfectly cohere. You might think some things are objectively wrong, like torturing innocent people, while also thinking that in other domains morality is more flexible and contextual. You might believe that moral truths exist while being uncertain about what grounds them or how we know them. And that's fine. That's honest. Perfect philosophical consistency is rare and possibly overrated. What matters is that you're aware of these deeper questions, that you recognize your ethical commitments rest on philosophical foundations that are themselves debatable, that you hold your views with appropriate humility, knowing that brilliant people have disagreed about these fundamental questions for millennia and will continue to disagree. That you're open to revising your thinking when you encounter compelling arguments or evidence. This awareness doesn't paralyze you. It doesn't mean you can't make moral judgments or take moral stands. It means you make those judgments and take those stands while recognizing their philosophical complexity. You can be firmly opposed to injustice while acknowledging that your account of what makes something unjust rests on contested philosophical ground. You can advocate passionately for reducing suffering while recognizing that your commitment to welfare as the ultimate moral value isn't self-evident to everyone. And this brings us to something crucial: the relationship between moral philosophy and moral practice. Kant and Mill weren't just building abstract theories for intellectual pleasure. They were trying to help people live better lives, to give practical guidance for moral decision-making. But the distance between theory and practice is significant. Even if you fully accept Kant's system intellectually, applying it in real situations requires judgment, interpretation, and practical wisdom. Even if you're a committed utilitarian, calculating actual consequences in complex situations is incredibly difficult and uncertain. This suggests that moral philosophy should be understood as providing frameworks for thinking, not algorithms for deciding. Kant gives you a framework that emphasizes respect for persons, universal principles, and moral integrity. Mill gives you a framework that emphasizes consequences, welfare, and practical improvement. Both frameworks can help you think more clearly about moral questions. Neither tells you exactly what to do in every situation with perfect certainty. The value of studying these systems isn't that you'll emerge with all the answers. It's that you'll emerge with better questions. You'll be able to identify when you're facing a genuine conflict between principle and consequence. You'll recognize when you're being asked to violate someone's dignity for the greater good. And you'll feel the weight of that choice rather than thoughtlessly accepting it. You'll notice when rigid adherence to rules is causing preventable harm, and you'll have the conceptual tools to think through whether flexibility is justified. This is what philosophical literacy looks like in ethics. Not certainty, but clarity. Not perfect answers, but better ways of framing questions. Not the elimination of moral difficulty, but a deeper understanding of why moral life is difficult and what's at stake in our choices. Part 12. What the debate reveals about you now turn inward. Because your preference for Kant or Mill, your intuitions about which system seems more compelling, reveals something about you. About your temperament, your values, your deepest commitments. This isn't a weakness or a bias. It's a feature of moral thinking. Ethics isn't just about abstract principles. It's about what kind of person you want to be and what kind of world you want to create. If you find yourself drawn to Kant, if his emphasis on duty and dignity resonates with you, it probably means you value integrity highly. You care about being consistent, about standing for principles that don't shift with circumstances. You're the kind of person who keeps promises even when it costs you, who tells the truth even when lying would be easier, who maintains boundaries and expects others to respect them. You might have a strong sense of right and wrong, clear lines you won't cross. You probably value autonomy, both your own and others. You want to make your own decisions, and you respect other people's right to make theirs, even when you disagree with their choices. This Kantian orientation often comes with certain strengths. You're likely trustworthy. People know where they stand with you. You don't manipulate or deceive. You treat commitments seriously. You have moral backbone. You won't be pressured into compromising your values just because everyone else is doing it, or because the consequences seem appealing. There's a nobility in this, a kind of moral heroism that refuses to bend even under pressure. But there are potential costs. You might be inflexible when flexibility would be wiser. You might prioritize being right over being effective. You might hold yourself and others to standards that are sometimes unreasonably demanding. You might struggle with moral trade-offs, with situations where every option violates some principle. You might find it hard to forgive yourself when you fall short of your ideals. And you might sometimes seem cold or rigid to people who operate more fluidly, who think consequences matter more than abstract principles. If you find yourself drawn to Mill, if consequentialism feels more natural to you, it probably means you're pragmatic and outcome-focused. You care less about abstract principles and more about what actually works. You're the kind of person who asks, what will happen if I do this? Who will be affected? How can I make things better? You're willing to bend rules if breaking them produces better results. You judge actions by their impact, not by the intentions behind them. You probably have a strong sense of compassion, a desire to reduce suffering and increase well-being in tangible, measurable ways. This Millian orientation has its own strengths. You're adaptable. You can respond to specific circumstances rather than rigidly applying general rules. You're focused on making real improvements in the world, not just maintaining your own moral purity. You're likely effective in positions of responsibility where you need to make consequential decisions affecting many people. You can make hard choices, prioritizing greater good over lesser, accepting difficult trade-offs when necessary. You're realistic about moral complexity and human limitations. But there are costs here too. You might sacrifice individuals for collective benefit too readily. You might struggle to maintain firm moral boundaries when the utilitarian calculus seems to justify crossing them. You might become calculating in a way that erodes genuine relationship and trust. You might find it hard to commit to principles when they're inconvenient. And you might sometimes rationalize self-serving behavior by convincing yourself it produces better outcomes than it actually does. Here's what's important. Neither temperament is simply better. Both have value. Both can be expressed in healthy or unhealthy ways. A healthy Kantianism maintains principles while exercising compassion and practical wisdom. An unhealthy Kantianism becomes rigid, judgmental, and detached from consequences. A healthy Millianism maximizes welfare while respecting individual dignity and rights. An unhealthy Millianism becomes manipulative, calculating, and willing to commit atrocities for the greater good. Your work, if you're serious about ethics, is to understand your own natural orientation and to cultivate the virtues of the other side. If you're naturally Kantian, you need to develop greater sensitivity to consequences, greater willingness to be flexible when rigidity causes harm. If you're naturally Millian, you need to develop greater respect for principles, greater recognition of moral boundaries that shouldn't be crossed even for good outcomes. This is where virtue ethics, the third major tradition in moral philosophy alongside Kantianism and Utilitarianism, becomes relevant. Virtue ethics says that being a good person is less about following rules or maximizing consequences and more about developing good character traits. Traits like honesty, courage, compassion, justice, practical wisdom, and notice. Good character requires both Kantian and Millian virtues. You need the Kantian virtues of integrity, respect, and principled commitment. And you need the Millian virtues of compassion, flexibility, and concern for welfare. The wisest people, the ones you most admire morally, probably embody both. They have principles they won't compromise, and they care deeply about consequences. They respect human dignity, and they work to reduce suffering. They're honest, and they're kind. They maintain boundaries, and they exercise compassion. They're neither rigid nor infinitely flexible. They hold the tension between Kant and Mill within themselves, and they navigate it with practical wisdom. This is what moral maturity looks like. Not choosing one system and dismissing the other, but integrating insights from both. Not eliminating the tension between principle and consequence, but learning to feel it clearly and respond to it wisely. Not achieving perfect consistency, but developing the judgment to know when each framework applies and the humility to acknowledge when you're uncertain. And this points to something both Kant and Mill underemphasized: the role of moral emotions and intuitions. Kant wanted morality to be purely rational, independent of feelings. Mill wanted it to be grounded in empirical observations about pleasure and pain. But both somewhat neglected the fact that moral life involves emotions like guilt, shame, empathy, indignation, and compassion. These emotions aren't just irrational impulses to be set aside. They're moral data, information about what matters. When you feel guilt about lying, even when the lie produces good consequences, that's your Kantian intuitions speaking. When you feel horror at the idea of letting someone die to preserve a principle, that's your Millian intuitions speaking. These feelings aren't infallible guides. They can be distorted by bias, conditioning, or ignorance, but they're not meaningless either. They often track something important about moral reality. A fully mature moral psychology integrates reason and emotion, principle and consequence, Kantian and Millian insights. You think carefully about what duty requires and what outcomes are likely. You feel the emotional weight of your choices. The guilt when you violate principles, the distress when your actions cause harm. You use both rational analysis and emotional sensitivity to navigate moral complexity. You don't let emotions override careful thinking, and you don't let thinking disconnect from the emotional reality of how your choices affect people. This integrated approach isn't theoretical, it's practical wisdom, what Aristotle called phronesis. It's the ability to discern what the situation calls for, to balance competing values, to act well in the specific circumstances you face. And it requires experience, not just study. You develop it by making decisions, seeing how they turn out, reflecting on what you could have done better, and gradually building a more refined moral sensibility. So, when you engage with Kant and Mill, don't just ask which one is right. Ask, what does each teach me? How can each make me a better person? How can I cultivate both the Kantian respect for dignity and principle, and the Millian concern for welfare and consequences? How can I hold both frameworks in creative tension, rather than forcing myself to choose exclusively? This approach won't give you algorithmic certainty about what to do in every situation. But it will give you something more valuable, a richer moral vocabulary, a deeper understanding of what's at stake in ethical choices, and a more nuanced capacity for moral judgment. You'll be able to recognize when you're facing a genuine dilemma between duty and consequence. You'll be able to articulate what's troubling about a proposed action, whether it violates dignity or produces bad outcomes. You'll be better equipped to explain your moral reasoning to others, and to evaluate theirs. And you'll be humbler, because once you see how brilliant people like Kant and Mill can build comprehensive systems that conflict so fundamentally, once you recognize that reasonable people can disagree about the foundations of morality itself, you'll hold your own views with appropriate tentativeness. You'll be confident in your values without being dogmatic. You'll be willing to stand up for what you believe while remaining open to the possibility that you might be wrong, that the situation might be more complex than you initially thought, that the other perspective might capture something important you've overlooked. This is the real gift of engaging seriously with moral philosophy. Not answers, but better questions. Not certainty, but clarity about what's uncertain. Not the elimination of moral difficulty, but the tools to navigate it thoughtfully. Part 13. The modern relevance. You might think this debate between Kant and Mill is historical. Something settled, or at least superseded by more recent philosophy. You'd be wrong. The tension between deontology and consequentialism, between rights-based and welfare-based ethics, is more alive today than ever. It shapes contemporary debates about technology, politics, justice, and how we should live. And understanding Kant and Mill gives you the tools to think clearly about these urgent modern questions. Consider artificial intelligence and automation. As machines become capable of making decisions that affect human lives, we face a fundamentally Kantian versus Millian question. Should AI systems be programmed to follow absolute rules, or should they calculate consequences and optimize for overall welfare? Take autonomous vehicles. A self-driving car faces an unavoidable accident. It can stay on course and kill 5 pedestrians, or swerve and kill its single passenger. What should it do? A Kantian approach might say, the car cannot actively kill its passenger, cannot use them as a means to save others. It must stay on course, even though more people die, because actively sacrificing someone violates their dignity. A Millian approach says, obviously save the 5. The math is simple. Program the car to minimize total deaths. This isn't hypothetical. Engineers are making these decisions right now, and the answer matters. It determines whether you can trust a car you ride in, whether pedestrians are safer or less safe, how liability gets assigned when accidents happen. Different philosophical frameworks produce different outcomes, different products, different societies. Or consider medical ethics in the age of scarce resources. During the COVID-19 pandemic, hospitals faced situations where they had more patients than ventilators. Who gets the life-saving equipment? Kantian thinking suggests you can't discriminate based on calculations about whose life is worth more. Every person has equal dignity. Maybe you use a lottery, or first come first served. Millian thinking suggests you should maximize lives saved and quality-adjusted life years. Give ventilators to those most likely to survive, to those with most life left to live. Save more people rather than fewer. Both approaches feel right in different ways, and both feel wrong in different ways. The Kantian approach respects equality and dignity, but accepts more total deaths. The Millian approach saves more lives but treats some people's lives as less valuable than others. There's no clean answer, but understanding the frameworks helps you see what's at stake. Why the choice is difficult. What values you're prioritizing. Think about privacy and surveillance in the digital age. Governments and corporations can monitor communications to prevent terrorism, crime, and harm. Should they? Kant would emphasize your right to privacy, your dignity, as an autonomous person whose private life shouldn't be invaded without consent. Even if surveillance prevents some harms, it treats citizens as potential threats to be monitored rather than as free agents deserving respect. Mill might say, if surveillance genuinely reduces suffering and crime, if the benefits to public safety outweigh the costs to privacy, then it's justified. Calculate the trade-off. Choose the option that produces better overall outcomes. Again, both positions capture something important. Privacy matters. But so does preventing terrorism and protecting innocent people. How you balance these depends partly on which philosophical framework you find more compelling. Partly on empirical questions about whether surveillance actually works, and partly on practical wisdom about what kind of society you want to live in. Consider criminal justice and punishment. Why do we punish criminals? A Kantian answer: because they deserve it. They've violated moral law, and justice demands that they be punished proportionally to their guilt. Punishment respects them as moral agents responsible for their choices. It's not about making society better, it's about giving people what they're due. A Millian answer: to reduce future crime. We punish to deter potential criminals, to rehabilitate offenders, to protect society from dangerous people. If punishment doesn't serve these purposes, if it just causes suffering without reducing crime, then it's pointless cruelty. These different justifications lead to different policies. Kantian retributivism supports punishing even when it doesn't deter. Supports proportional punishment even when lighter sentences would work better. Opposes letting guilty people go even when punishment would be counterproductive. Millian consequentialism supports whatever actually reduces crime, even if that means very harsh penalties for some crimes and very light ones for others. Even if it means not punishing when punishment won't help. The same tension appears in debates about economic justice and redistribution. Should we tax the wealthy to help the poor? Kant might focus on rights. Do people have a right to keep what they've legitimately earned, or do those in need have a right to support? The answer depends on which rights are more fundamental, which duties we have to each other as members of a political community. Mill would focus on outcomes. Does redistribution increase overall welfare? If taking from those who have plenty and giving to those in desperate need produces more total happiness, then it's justified. Calculate the utility. Consider diminishing marginal returns on wealth, and redistribute accordingly. Or think about global obligations. Do wealthy nations have duties to poor ones? Do you personally have obligations to distant strangers suffering from poverty, disease, or violence. Kant says, respect for human dignity is universal. Everyone deserves to have their basic needs met, their rights protected. You can't ignore suffering just because it's far away. But Kant also emphasizes voluntary action over forced redistribution, autonomy over compulsion. Mill says, suffering is suffering regardless of distance. If you can prevent more suffering by donating to effective international charities than by helping locally, you should do so. Maximize welfare globally, not just for your community. These frameworks shape contemporary movements. Effective altruism, the movement encouraging people to donate to the most cost-effective charities and to choose careers that do the most good, is fundamentally Millian. It's about calculating impact and maximizing welfare. Human rights advocacy, focusing on protecting dignity and opposing violations, regardless of consequences, is fundamentally Kantian. It's about respecting persons and maintaining absolute moral boundaries. Environmental ethics draws on both traditions too. Kantian environmentalists might argue that nature has intrinsic value, that we have duties to preserve ecosystems regardless of their utility to humans. Millian environmentalists focus on human welfare. We should protect the environment because environmental destruction harms current and future people. Because climate change causes enormous suffering. Even in personal life, modern dilemmas often pit Kantian against Millian thinking. Should you tell your friend their partner is cheating? Kant says, tell the truth, respect their autonomy, give them information they need to make informed decisions. Mill says, calculate consequences, consider whether telling will cause more harm than good. Think about whether your friend would be happier knowing or not knowing. Should you have children in a world facing climate change and uncertainty? Kant might focus on the inherent value of creating new persons, on the meaning of family and continuation of humanity. Mill would focus on whether the children would have good lives, whether bringing them into existence increases or decreases total welfare, whether you could do more good helping existing people than creating new ones. Should you pursue a high-paying career to donate large amounts to charity, or a directly helpful career with lower pay? Kant might emphasize authenticity and using your talents in ways that respect your own rational nature. Mill would say, do whatever maximizes your positive impact on the world. Whatever reduces the most suffering or produces the most good. The point is this: Kant and Mill aren't dead historical figures. They're living traditions that continue to shape how we think about the most important questions facing individuals and societies. Every time a court weighs rights against public benefit, every time a doctor makes a triage decision, every time a policymaker balances individual liberty against collective welfare, every time you decide whether to follow a rule or break it for better outcomes, the ghost of this debate is present. And it's not just that their ideas remain relevant. It's that the fundamental tension they identified between duty and consequence, between respect for persons and promotion of welfare, is built into moral reality itself. It's not going away. Future philosophers won't solve it definitively. They'll refine the arguments, develop more sophisticated versions of each position, find new ways to try to integrate them. But the core tension will remain, which means you need to understand it. You need to be able to think clearly about when rights should constrain welfare maximization and when welfare considerations should override rigid rules. You need to recognize these patterns when they appear in political debates, policy discussions, and your own moral choices. You need the conceptual vocabulary that Kant and Mill provide. Part 14. The synthesis that cannot be so. Where does this leave us? After all this analysis, after seeing both systems from multiple angles, after understanding their strengths and limitations, their practical applications and theoretical foundations, Can we finally answer the original question, Kant or Mill? Rules that save us or rules that trap us? Which one is right? The honest answer, the one you've probably been sensing throughout this journey, is that neither is completely right and neither is completely wrong. They're both capturing something essential about morality, something that can't be reduced to the other framework, something that resists simple synthesis. And this isn't a failure of philosophy. It's a reflection of genuine complexity in the moral domain itself. Here's what we can say with confidence. Kant is right that persons have dignity that shouldn't be violated for consequentialist reasons. There are moral boundaries, things you simply cannot do to people, regardless of how much good it might produce. Torturing innocents is wrong. Enslaving minorities is wrong. Using people as mere instruments is wrong. And these wrongnesses don't depend entirely on empirical calculations about long-term consequences. They're grounded in something deeper, in the respect owed to beings capable of reason, autonomy, and moral agency. But Mill is also right that consequences matter enormously. A moral system that tells you to ignore preventable suffering, that says you shouldn't lie even to save lives, that prioritizes abstract principle over concrete human welfare, has lost sight of what morality is for. Morality exists to help us live well together, to reduce suffering, to promote flourishing. If it doesn't serve those purposes, if it becomes pure rule-following, disconnected from impact on actual lives, it's become empty ritual. Both truths stand, and they conflict. Not always, but often enough that you can't just pretend the conflict doesn't exist. There are genuine dilemmas where respecting rights means accepting worse outcomes, and where promoting welfare means violating dignity. These aren't just thought experiments. They're real situations that doctors face, that policymakers face, that you might face in your own life. The temptation is to look for a master theory that resolves this conflict, that shows how rights and welfare can both be respected without ever having to choose between them. And philosophers have tried. Some argue that Kantian rights themselves are justified by their long-term consequences, so there's really no conflict. Others argue that consequentialism, properly understood, includes respect for persons as a constraint, not just as an instrumental value. Still others develop hybrid theories that try to combine elements of both frameworks into a coherent whole. These attempts are valuable. They've generated insights and moved the debate forward. But they haven't eliminated the fundamental tension. Because at some point, in some situations, you have to decide. Do principles constrain consequences absolutely, or do consequences sometimes override principles? And however you answer that question, you've chosen a side. You've said either that Kant is ultimately right, that there are absolute moral constraints, or that Mill is ultimately right, that everything is negotiable if the welfare calculation demands it. Maybe the right response isn't to force a synthesis, but to accept the tension, to recognize that morality has two poles, two sources of normativity that both make legitimate claims on us. Kant represents one pole, the demands of respect, dignity, integrity, and principled commitment. Mill represents the other, the demands of compassion, welfare, pragmatism, and consequential responsibility. And moral wisdom lies not in eliminating one pole in favor of the other, but in navigating between them thoughtfully. This doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean morality is relative or subjective. It means moral reality is complex, that multiple values can be objectively important even when they conflict, that reasonable people can disagree about how to balance competing considerations without one side being simply wrong. Think of it like this. In physics, light behaves both like a wave and like a particle. These seem contradictory, but both are true. Light has wave-particle duality. You can't reduce one aspect to the other. You need both frameworks to fully understand light. Maybe morality has something similar. Maybe it has duty-consequence duality. Maybe you need both Kantian and Millian frameworks to fully understand moral reality, even though they sometimes point in different directions. This parallel isn't perfect. Physics can integrate wave and particle descriptions into quantum mechanics. Ethics hasn't achieved an equivalent integration of duty and consequence. Maybe it never will. Maybe the integration is impossible in principle because moral frameworks are irreducibly plural, because there are multiple genuine sources of moral value that can't be reduced to a single principle. Or maybe we just haven't found the right integration yet. Maybe some future philosopher will develop a theory that genuinely synthesizes Kantian and Millian insights in a way that seems as obvious and compelling as quantum mechanics does in physics. It's possible. Philosophy progresses. Ideas that once seemed irreconcilable sometimes get integrated in surprising ways. But for now, in your actual moral life, you have to navigate between the frameworks without a perfect synthesis. And here's what that means practically. You should have Kantian commitments. Principles you won't violate. Rights you'll respect absolutely. Boundaries you'll maintain regardless of consequences. These should include things like not torturing, not enslaving, not lying to people you're in relationships of trust with, not using people merely as tools. These principles create the framework within which you operate. Within that framework, you should think like a consequentialist. You should try to make things better rather than worse. You should consider who will be affected by your actions and how. You should work to reduce suffering and promote welfare. You should be willing to bend rules when doing so clearly produces better outcomes without violating core Kantian constraints. You should be pragmatic, adaptive, focused on what actually works. This isn't perfectly consistent in theory. A pure Kantian would say consequences never override principles. A pure Millian would say principles only matter as rules of thumb for promoting welfare. But it's how most morally serious people actually think, and it's probably how you should think too. You have non-negotiable commitments, and you have pragmatic flexibility. You respect dignity, and you care about outcomes. You maintain integrity, and you adapt to circumstances. The key is knowing which framework applies when, and that requires judgment, practical wisdom, the kind of moral maturity that comes from experience and reflection rather than from following an algorithm. You develop it by making decisions, seeing how they play out, thinking about what you could have done better, and gradually building a more refined moral sensibility. Some decisions are clearly in one domain or the other. Don't torture people, that's Kantian, and no consequentialist calculation changes it. Choose the medical treatment most likely to save lives. That's Millian, and no principle tells you to do otherwise. But other decisions are genuinely difficult, genuinely requiring trade-offs between respect for persons and promotion of welfare, and in those cases, you make the best judgment you can, knowing that reasonable people might disagree, that you might be wrong, that moral reality is complicated enough that there might not be a single right answer. This is uncomfortable. You might want certainty. You might want a clear rule that tells you exactly what to do in every situation. But that's not available. What's available is a richer understanding of what's at stake, better tools for thinking through difficult choices, and the intellectual honesty to admit when you're uncertain, rather than pretending you have answers you don't actually have. And there's something liberating in this once you accept that perfect moral certainty isn't available. That even brilliant philosophers can build comprehensive systems that fundamentally conflict. You can stop beating yourself up for not having all the answers. You can make decisions with appropriate confidence, Stand by your principles while remaining open to revision. Take moral risks, knowing you might be wrong, but that inaction is also a choice with consequences. You can also extend more charity to others who disagree with you. If someone weighs rights and welfare differently than you do, that doesn't necessarily mean they're immoral or irrational. It might mean they're emphasizing a different aspect of moral reality. Standing at a different point in the space between Kant and Mill, you can engage with their reasoning, challenge their conclusions, argue for your position, while recognizing that the disagreement might be deep and legitimate rather than shallow and easily resolved. This is moral maturity. Not having all the answers, but having better questions. Not eliminating uncertainty, but understanding what's uncertain and why. Not choosing one system exclusively, but integrating insights from multiple traditions into a coherent, if imperfect, approach to living well. Part 15. Your verdict, your life. You've traveled far. You've seen Kant's Cathedral of Reason, austere and magnificent, demanding that you treat every person as an end, that you follow principles you could universalize, that you maintain your integrity regardless of consequences. You've explored Mill's calculus of flourishing, flexible, and pragmatic, insisting that you focus on outcomes, that you work to maximize welfare, that you adapt your actions to produce the most good. You've watched both systems shine and both stumble. You've heard the critics sharpen their knives, and you've sat with the uncomfortable truth that neither framework fully captures moral reality, that the tension between them is real and inescapable. So now, what? Now, you have to live. Now you have to make actual decisions in the actual world, with incomplete information and competing values and genuine uncertainty about what's right. The philosophy doesn't do that for you. It equips you. It gives you frameworks for thinking, vocabulary for articulating what's at stake, awareness of the trade-offs you're making. But the choices remain yours. And here's the final, most important truth. Your moral life isn't primarily about which philosophical system you endorse. It's about what kind of person you become, what values you embody, how you treat the people around you. You could be a perfect Kantian in theory and a terrible person in practice. You could be a committed utilitarian on paper and cause enormous harm through miscalculation or self-deception. The philosophy matters, but it's not the whole story. What matters more is whether you're developing moral virtues. Are you becoming more honest, more compassionate, more courageous, more just, more wise? Are you learning to see situations clearly, to notice when you're rationalizing, to recognize your own biases and limitations? Are you cultivating the kind of character that responds well to moral challenges, not because you've memorized the right philosophical system, but because you've become the kind of person who cares about doing right and has the judgment to discern what that means in specific circumstances? This is where Kant and Mill converge, even though they'd phrase it differently. Kant would say, you're developing your rational autonomy, your capacity to govern yourself according to moral law. Mill would say, you're cultivating dispositions that reliably produce good outcomes, character traits that contribute to overall welfare. But both are pointing at something similar: moral growth, the ongoing process of becoming better at living well. And this process requires both frameworks. You need Kant's emphasis on principle to avoid becoming purely calculating, to maintain boundaries that protect human dignity, to develop the kind of integrity that makes you trustworthy. You need Mill's emphasis on consequences to avoid becoming rigidly dogmatic, to stay focused on actually helping people, to develop the kind of pragmatism that makes you effective. Think about the people you most admire morally. Not hypothetical ideal agents, but real people you've known or read about. People who've shown exceptional moral character in difficult circumstances. What do they have? Usually, they have both. They have principles they won't compromise. And they have deep concern for how their actions affect others. They're honest, and they're kind. They maintain boundaries, and they exercise compassion. They're guided by duty, and they're motivated by care. This integration isn't accidental. It's what moral excellence looks like. It's what you should aspire to, regardless of whether you identify more with Kant or Mill philosophically. You should be able to say, "These are my principles, the lines I won't cross, the commitments I won't abandon." And you should also be able to say, "I care deeply about consequences, about reducing suffering and promoting flourishing, about making the world tangibly better." So here's your task going forward. Take what you've learned from this exploration and use it. When you face a moral decision, ask yourself the Kantian questions. What principle am I following? Could I will this to be universal? Am I treating people as ends or merely as means? Am I maintaining my integrity? Then ask the million questions. What are the likely consequences? Who will be affected? How can I maximize welfare? What outcome would reduce the most suffering? Often, both sets of questions will point in the same direction. When they do, act with confidence. When they conflict, that's when you need wisdom. That's when you need to weigh the values at stake. Consider which matters more in this specific context. Make the best judgment you can. And then act, knowing you might be wrong, but knowing that inaction is also a choice with moral weight. Be willing to hold tension. Don't force premature resolution. Sit with the difficulty of choices where every option has costs. Don't pretend conflicts between duty and consequence are easy to resolve. Acknowledge the genuine moral complexity of situations where rights and welfare pull in different directions. This acknowledgement isn't weakness, it's honesty. It's moral seriousness, and be humble. Kant and Mill, two of the most brilliant moral philosophers who ever lived, couldn't resolve this fundamental tension. Centuries of subsequent philosophy haven't resolved it. You won't either, not completely. But you can live with it thoughtfully. You can make principled decisions while remaining open to revision. You can stand firm on your core values while acknowledging that reasonable people might weigh things differently. You can be confident without being dogmatic, committed without being rigid. Remember that moral philosophy is a living conversation, not a settled doctrine. New challenges emerge. Technology creates dilemmas Kant and Mill never imagined. Social progress reveals moral blind spots in historical thinkers. You're not just applying old frameworks to new situations. You're participating in an ongoing dialogue about how to live well, contributing your own experiences and insights, learning from others, evolving your understanding. This means engaging with perspectives beyond Kant and Mill. Read contemporary ethics. Consider feminist critiques of traditional moral philosophy. Explore non-Western ethical traditions. Think about how race, class, and power affect moral questions. Kant and Mill give you a foundation, but the conversation is much broader. Every tradition, every perspective, offers potential insights. Stay curious. Stay open, but also stay grounded. Don't become so obsessed with philosophical questions that you neglect the simple, everyday, moral demands of treating people decently. Most moral life isn't about grand dilemmas. It's about keeping your word, being honest in small ways, showing up for people who need you, doing your share of collective work, controlling your temper, admitting when you're wrong. The philosophy should make you better at these ordinary moral tasks, not distract you from them, and practice self-compassion alongside moral seriousness. You will fail. You will make mistakes. You will compromise principles you wish you'd maintained. You will produce outcomes worse than you intended. This is guaranteed. You're human, not a perfectly rational moral agent. The question isn't whether you'll fall short, it's whether you'll learn from it, whether you'll keep trying, whether you'll become gradually better over time. Kant and Mill both believed in moral progress, both for individuals and for societies. They believed we could learn, grow, improve our moral understanding and our moral practice. That belief seems warranted. You can see it in your own life if you look honestly. You're probably a better person now than you were 10 years ago. More aware of others' needs, more thoughtful about consequences, more principled about certain things. That's moral growth. It's real. It's available. Keep growing. Keep thinking. Keep caring. Use Kant to keep you honest, to maintain your integrity, to respect the dignity of everyone you encounter. Use Mill to keep you effective, to focus on making things better, to reduce preventable suffering. Use both to navigate the complexity of moral life with wisdom and humility. And remember, the debate between rules that save us and rules that trap us isn't something you settle once and for all. It's something you live, every day, in decisions large and small. Sometimes the rules save you, providing guidance and protecting values you care about. Sometimes they trap you, demanding adherence even when flexibility would be wiser. Your job isn't to eliminate this tension. Your job is to feel it clearly, to understand what's at stake on both sides, and to respond with the best judgment you can muster. This is your moral life. Not Kant's, not Mill's, yours. You inherit their insights, their frameworks, their questions. But the answers you give, the choices you make, the person you become, that's entirely your responsibility. And that's as it should be. Because morality isn't about following someone else's system perfectly. It's about developing your own capacity for good judgment, for principled action, for compassionate engagement with a complex world. You have what you need now. The tools, the vocabulary, the understanding of what's at stake. The frameworks for thinking clearly about duty and consequence, principle and outcome, rights and welfare. What you do with these tools, how you use them to build a life of meaning and integrity, that's up to you. Go forward thoughtfully, question deeply, act courageously, hold your principles, consider your consequences, respect persons, promote welfare, navigate the tension, embrace the complexity, and above all, keep trying to be good in a world that makes goodness difficult but not impossible. That's the real verdict. Not Kant over Mill or Mill over Kant, not rules that save us or rules that trap us, but the recognition that moral excellence requires both, that wisdom lies in integration rather than exclusion, that you need the insights of both traditions to live well. And then, having recognized that, doing the hard work of actually living it, the conversation between Kant and Mill continues in you, in your choices, in your struggles with competing values, in your attempts to honor both dignity and welfare, both principle and consequence. That conversation is now yours to carry forward. Make it count.